Okay, well, Keith is no stranger to all of us, but for the sake of the recording and the newer members, Keith Swenson, MD, is a retired medical doctor who now teaches courses in biology and geology at Multnomah University in Portland, Oregon. He has served for 20 years as president of Portland's Design Science Association and was on the board of the Seven Wonders Museum near Mount St. Helens. Keith especially enjoys leading field trips and has taken hundreds of Mount St. Helen hikes, the Columbia Gorge, Northwest Forest, and the Grand Canyon. Keith has a BS in zoology from the University of Idaho and an MD from Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. He and his wife, Connie, have 4 grown children. Let's welcome Keith.
Well, thank you, Marianne. Good to see all of you today, and I think we have an interesting topic. You all like forests, probably. Good to hike in. We have such beautiful forests in the Northwest. Before I start, I just want to mention that it'll behoove you to pay good attention to what I say and to what's in the slides. I'll back it up there. Because at break, you can go back to the table where Steve Haley will be, and you can take a piece of paper, and I've got 10 specimens there. And you can write on the piece of paper what each of those is, because you will have seen it or heard about it. And then if you complete the activity, I didn't say get it all right, I said complete it, there's a prize. I'm not going to tell you what it is. You have to find out. Well, the title of our program today is Forests Declare the Glory of God. You're familiar with the heavens declare the glory of God. Well, we're saying forests also declare the glory of God. And there's no better place within which to contemplate that message than here, in a redwood forest in Northern California in the early morning fog. How many have seen the redwoods? Lots of you. Yeah, that's a great place. Coast redwoods are up to 380 feet or so tall. They're the tallest trees on Earth. And giant sequoias, in contrast, rarely top 300 feet, but they're the most massive trees. And then, of course, bristlecone pines are the oldest. Now, after the sun has burned off the mists of morning, these vine maples, their leaves display this vibrant green color in the understory of the redwood forest. And here we see a profusion of sword ferns, which cover the forest floor, and a banana slug is patrolling the greenery. It's quite a beautiful creature. Sometimes large animals also, like this Roosevelt elk, are seen. Now, in the spring of 1992, Design Science Association began offering forest field trips, not in the redwoods, but along the Clackamas River in the Mount Hood National Forest. And this photo was taken on the Alder Flat Trail near Ripplebrook. And since that beginning 30 years ago, DSA and Creation Encounter have conducted close to something like 100 forest trips with over 1,000 participants. So we're pleased that so many people have gone out and seen the woods. It's better to see it in person than just on the films there. But in September of 2020, the 138,000-acre Riverside Fire burned our Clackamas site, as seen here. And this photo was taken on the Alder Flat Trail, which I previously showed you. We then moved our trips to the beautiful forest along the Salmon River, also in the Mount Hood National Forest, and we're continuing to do trips there today. Now, before I go further, there's 2 terms I want to define, and the first is ecology. For the last 21 years, I've taught a course in ecology at Multnomah University, and soon after starting, another professor told me that he was very surprised that a Christian school would teach such a subject, and apparently he was equating ecology with more like radical environmentalism. And I've had other responses of a similar nature. So what is ecology? And here's a definition. Ecology is, first of all, a division of biology, biology being the scientific study of life, that deals with interactions between organisms and their environments. It's as simple as that. And so examples of ecological topics or studies would be studying the behavior of forest fires, like that big Riverside fire, or determining why Western Oregon forests are dominated by conifers, where if you go to the Appalachian forests in the east, there's broadleaf trees. Why is that? That's an ecological question. And another issue would be documenting the responses of biology to the eruption of Mount St. Helens, which we're very interested in. Those are issues of ecology. Now, some also define ecology, as it says here, as simply the study of ecosystems, which brings us to our second term. And we'll use this term quite a bit. So an ecosystem is all the organisms in an area. You can call that the biota, plus all the non-living components of the same area, the water, the sunshine, the air, fire, mountains, everything. So all of that working together as a system, as a whole. And again, we're defining system there as a group of parts working together as a whole, like the human body as a system, the automobile is a system, Multnomah University was a system, and so the ecosystems can be thought of as parts working together in a harmonious fashion. So does a forest like this then consist just of the trees? No, it includes everything. It is an ecosystem. Well, as in all matters here at DSA, we want to base our thinking on biblical truth, on a biblical worldview. So what does the Bible say about forests? Well, it says quite a bit, actually. Here are some biblical teachings that are relevant. First of all, we all know that the Bible teaches that God created the earth, which would include forest ecosystems. Therefore, we expect to find evidences of design, of irreducible complexity, beauty, and so forth, not just in the organisms themselves, but in the whole ecosystem, the way it works as a system, the way it works, way everything works together. And this will be a major theme that I'll develop as we go along. Also, God, because He is the creator, owns the earth, including forests. It's ultimately His property. And being omniscient, God has exhaustive knowledge of His creation, and that includes forests. And He also is in control of the processes operating on the earth, like photosynthesis and the hydrologic or water cycle. But God also delegated to mankind dominion. That is the task of ruling or stewarding or managing, however you want to say it, the creation for mankind's good and for God's glory. And this includes timber harvest, as in the building of the temple in Jerusalem, described in the book of Ezra. The dominion mandate now also implies that people must acquire knowledge of the creation, that is, of forests in our case, through scientific study, through good scientific study, in order to be good stewards, to carry out the dominion mandate. Another major theme that I'd like to develop as we go along. And lastly, I put down that the curse and Noah's flood and the subsequent ice age following the Noah's flood profoundly affected forests and have a lot to do with their history and so forth, and need to be taken into account. And of course, there's a lot more we could say, but time doesn't permit to go further, I think. So let's look a little bit at the ecology of Northwest forests. The image shown here is of one of our big conifer or cone-bearing trees. It's a Sitka spruce, which requires lots of rain and fog, so it only grows near the Pacific Ocean. And I took this photo in the Olympic National Forest. Now shown here is a map of the Northwest so-called Pacific Maritime Forest. It often is simply called the West Side Forest, and I'll use that term. But the dark there is the forest. And it begins with the Redwoods in Northern California and stretches nearly 2,000 miles north to near Glacier Bay in southeast Alaska. And in Oregon and Washington, this wet coastal strip of forest extends from the Pacific Ocean eastward to the crest of the Cascade Range and a little beyond. And then if you go further east into the rain shadow of the Cascades, There are dry forests of pine and oak and juniper and such. This diagram is important, and it shows two major types of forests that we see in the Northwest. Look at the bottom one first. The bottom one shows that the forest, the previous forest to the left there, was clear-cut. The logs would have been hauled to a mill, and then the remaining forest debris piled up and burned. The site was then probably treated with herbicides and replanted with one tree species. Usually that's Douglas fir in our area. And then about every 35 to 70 years or so, the process is repeated. So this is basically a farm, an agricultural effort to grow wood, and it works well. Usually we call these plantations or forest plantations, and they represent a high percentage, up to 90% of forests in many areas. And then contrast that with the top diagram, which shows a forest that was burned in a forest fire. There was a disturbance, in other words, at the left side of that picture. The forest was not completely destroyed, but it was damaged, and many things, of course, survived as well. And then it shows the forest developing and enlarging and growing and so forth continuously for a 300-year period, producing a forest that is quite different than the plantation forest, of course. And so this top diagram is labeled a natural forest, or you might call it an unmanaged forest. And it's this unmanaged forest that I'll be talking about particularly this morning, because it seems reasonable to think that evidences of the Creator's design and providential care would be more evident here than in plantations. Well, here are 5 important west side forest trees. Maybe 1 or 2 is in the back there, so you better pay attention. And these are some that I will mention in the talk. There are 3 conifers, or cone-bearing trees, the Douglas fir, the western hemlock, and the western red cedar, and 2 broadleaf trees, the bigleaf maple and the red alder. There are, of course, other species in our forests, but we can't cover them all. Now here's a Douglas fir, a branch of a Douglas fir, which we're probably very familiar with. And notice that I hyphenated the word Douglas fir. And that's because Douglas fir is not a fir tree at all. It's nothing to do with a fir. It's a Douglas fir, and that's a separate sort of category, separate organism. If you have a grand fir, for example, or a noble fir, you don't put the hyphen in because they are true firs. Well, the needles then of the Douglas fir are relatively short or medium to short, and they're attached singly, not in groups, to all sides of the twig, giving this sort of a bottle brush, bushy appearance to the branch. An average 200-foot Douglas fir has been calculated to have about 60 million needles with a total surface area of over 1 acre. You wonder what poor graduate student had to figure that out. Douglas fir buds are distinctly reddish and sharply pointed. You'll see that at the back table maybe if you look hard. They're very distinctive. And the seed cones are unique also. They have these 3-pointed bracts, so-called, sticking out from between the scales. You might wonder how they came to be. Well, the story goes that once upon a time, there was a forest fire, and there were a lot of mice in the forest. Little, very, very, very tiny mice. And those mice got very frightened of the forest fire, and so they climbed up the Douglas fir tree because they knew that Douglas firs often survive forest fires. And those mice tried to hide between the scales of the Douglas fir cones, but they couldn't quite make it in, so to this very day, you see the tail and the 2 hind legs sticking out. Now that comes to us, I think, from the native peoples on down through outdoor school, and it's now being taught at universities. So, I mean, it's easy to remember that. I mean, if I just said it has 3-pointed bracts, would you remember that? No. So, look how tiny one Douglas fir seed is. And you can see the dark part being the seed, and then the wing used in dispersal is there also. But think about the fact that in that seed there's enough genetic information, enough detailed information, which is needed to produce a 250-foot giant of the forest. And that's amazing. Jesus talked about a mustard seed. Maybe if he was in the Northwest, he would have talked about the Douglas fir, or maybe, same idea, same idea. The Douglas fir bark is very thick, in the older trees at least, and furrowed like this. And this is one reason that the Douglas firs often do survive forest fires. This thick bark insulates and protects the only living parts of a tree trunk. And the only living parts of a tree trunk are thin layers of cells, one called the phloem and the other the cambium, that are just beneath the bark. So that bark can burn, but the inner part often does not burn and the tree survives. If you cut into the bark of a Douglas fir, it looks like this, a pattern of light and dark that some people describe as a stack of bacon. So now I think you know how to identify a Douglas fir. Western hemlock looks very different than the Douglas fir. The needles are much shorter. They vary somewhat in length. The foliage is more flat, not so bushy. And its cones are quite small in comparison to the Douglas fir. And the bark of the hemlock is thick, or not thick, it's thin. It's quite thin. And so in forest fires, it is readily killed by the fire compared to the Douglas fir. And we have western red cedar as well, and it grows in the wet areas, moist areas. It's easy to recognize because its foliage doesn't even have needles. Its foliage is made of tiny scales put together in this pattern. And then its cones, as seen developing here, are said to look like miniature rosebuds, and I think they sort of do. And then we have a deciduous tree, the bigleaf maple, and the bigleaf maple has really big leaves. And it's the main main deciduous tree that is common out in our old forests. Oftentimes these maple trees are really covered by mosses and ferns and other plants growing on the limbs, and we'll come back to that topic in a bit as well. And then the last tree I want to mention is the red alder. It grows in very disturbed areas, like after forest fires have burned an area, or sometimes often it occurs along streams where the areas get flooded periodically. It's very seldom do you find this in the old forests. And this view was taken along the Hummocks Trail at Mount St. Helens, so this was, of course, a very disturbed area not too long ago. Well, now we should consider the question, what parts of a forest are the most biologically active? That is, have the most organisms, the most types of organisms, and have the most processes where the action is, And there's two areas, the forest canopy and the forest floor and soil. And it turns out that these are also the two most poorly understood parts of a forest, and that's largely because they are hard to access and they are very complicated. So let's look at both of those. And we'll start with the forest canopy. The forest canopy can be defined in many ways, but a simple approach to it would be just to say that the canopy is the upper layer of a forest composed of mature tree crowns and associated organisms. So let's go visit the canopy. And here's just the place to do that. And it's the Wind River Canopy Crane Research Facility in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest near Carson, Washington. And I took a short course in canopy science there in 1999. Now you can't do that today because it was established in 1995, and then it persisted for 16 years, but in 2011, the crane was taken down and disassembled. Well, here's how we got up into the forest canopy in this so-called gondola. And most of the group here were rangers from the Olympic National Park, but there were a few others of us that went. And the gondola was hoisted 225 feet by this large construction crane, which had been previously and recently used to build skyscrapers in San Francisco. This is David Shaw. He's a forest ecologist, and he was director of the research facility. For safety, we all had to wear hard hats, and we all had to be tethered to the gondola itself, and nobody did fall out, so that was good. We are now above the forest, and we're looking down on 200-foot trees. And the crane operator, whose name was Mark Creighton, I believe, he was able to move that gondola up and down from the ground to over 200 feet. And he was able to move the gondola out on the jib, or the long arm of the crane. And he could also move that jib around in a 360-degree circle. So it was a big cylinder of force that was contained in the reach of that equipment. And so a researcher might say to the operator, I would like to go to tree number 48. Well, they all had numbers, the trees. Tree number 48 at 150 feet. And so Mark Creighton would push some buttons in the controls there, and the gondola would glide to the proper spot, and the researcher could maybe collect samples of a lichen or mistletoe or whatever he was studying and researching. So it was quite an amazing piece of equipment. Someone likened our silent, effortless glide through the trees to scuba diving, and to scuba diving, say, on a coral reef. And I guess there's a little comparison there. It was quite an interesting and unique experience. Here's the top of a dead tree, which would be called a snag, and snags are important for wildlife, of course. Hanging here on this tree, up in the canopy, is a species of lichen known as old man's beard. If you don't remember what a lichen is, and I'll be mentioning lichens, but a lichen is a symbiosis. It's a close living association, in other words, between a fungus, which makes the structure of the lichen, and cells of algae, which are greenish in color, give a little color to the lichen. And the algae photosynthesize to feed themselves, and they also feed the fungus. So and oftentimes there's a special bacteria that's in these lichens as well that we'll come to in a minute. So this is kind of a win-win situation. The algae provides the food, and the fungus provides the house. They cooperate together, and both benefit from the association. And these lichens are called epiphytes. And epiphyte means upon a plant. Epi is upon, phyte is a plant. So these are plants or lichens, or occasionally some other things that grow on another plant without harming it. In other words, they're not parasites. They're not hurting their host. Examples, common examples are mosses and ferns, and if you go into the tropics, the orchids, the air plants, and that down there are epiphytes oftentimes as well. Now, canopy research in Northwest forests began really in the 1970s at Oregon State University, and it focused initially on the process of nitrogen fixation. And I want to give you just a little review of that topic in case you're not really up on nitrogen fixation. You've probably heard of it. But all organisms require nitrogen because nitrogen is required to build the amino acids that make up proteins. It's required to build DNA and RNA and other things, enzymes, for example. And so it's really important. And our air is 78% nitrogen. Nitrogen gas is two nitrogen atoms stuck together, N2. But organisms can't use that. Most organisms can't use that at all, even though there's a lot of nitrogen available. And what it takes is special bacteria that are designed to take nitrogen from the air and put it into a compound like a fertilizer, which plants and animals can use. And so that is called nitrogen fixation. Now, plants and lichens do not fix nitrogen. What they do is they provide homes within themselves for these special bacteria. You might think of the soybean. A soybean, if you pull the plant up, it has little nodules stuck to its roots. And those little nodules are made by the soybean plant, but they are homes for the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And so that's the sort of situation we're talking about. Well, here's the Salmon River forest where we are conducting field trips these days. And that's also in the Mount Hood National Forest. And you can see a stand of red alder trees is growing in the riparian zone. That's the streamside zone. I labeled the alder there. And alder fixes nitrogen, large amounts of it, and it pumps that nitrogen, puts it into the soil. And so it's a very useful plant. But on the hillside there, or on the mountain where there's strictly conifers, no alder, maybe a little maple up there, but no alder, that forest needs nitrogen compounds as well. And it needs it over a long period of time. And the question is, what fixes nitrogen for the conifer forest, for the older forests? And back in the 1970s, there was no answer to that question. Well, Bill Dennison was a forest ecologist at Oregon State University back in the 70s, and he became interested in this idea of nitrogen fixation, and he became interested in this material that you can see lying on the forest floor there, which is a type of lichen called lungwort, or has a scientific name of Loberia oregana. You've probably seen this if you hike through old forests. It lays here and there on the forest floor. But he noticed that if he would go into young forests, or certainly into plantations, he found none of this. It seemed to be confined to the old forest. And so Dennison started wondering if maybe this lichen might be the nitrogen fixer that provides for the old forests. And he wondered if enough of that lichen grew up there in the canopy to do that. In his lab, Dennison tested Loberia to see if it actually could fix nitrogen, and it really did. It did a good job of it. But was there enough in the canopy to supply the forest? And back in the 1970s, the forest canopy was unknown territory. It was a frontier up there. Most people had never been up there and hadn't been studied, and it seemed almost impossible to work productively up in the canopy of these big trees. So that was discussed at Oregon State University in a class, and a couple of young ladies, student assistants, I guess, came up to Dennison, and they said, well, we think we can get you guys up in the canopy. And it turned out these two young ladies, Diane Tracy, Diane Nielsen, were skilled rock climbers. And they thought they could and did adapt rock climbing techniques to climbing 200-foot trees very successfully, and taught the others how to do it. And when they got up in the canopy, it was loaded with this lichen. It was all over the place. And they've calculated that in many areas, there's about 1/4 of a ton dry weight per acre. That's a lot of lichen that grows up there and falls down. It's what's fixing the nitrogen for the old forests. So here's a summary of nitrogen fixation following a forest fire. On drier areas after the forest fire, there's a plant called snowbrush, or you may know it as Ceanothus, which is its genus name. And it tends to grow on somewhat dry sites, but its seeds fall to the ground and stay in the soil for decades. It just doesn't germinate into plants until it's heated up by a forest fire. So the forest fire causes this seed of snowbrush to germinate, and then it produces a shrub within months, and that shrub is capable of fixing nitrogen, or at least it provides homes for bacteria that fix nitrogen. If you're in a more moist area, it's the red alder that does the job. The red alder can colonize these forest fire burns, for example, and for decades, several decades, it will fix nitrogen. But eventually the alder is replaced by conifer trees growing in. And after about 100 years after the fire, the Loberia, this lungwort lichen, starts to establish. And it establishes and becomes extremely abundant, and it fixes nitrogen for centuries, hundreds of years in the old growth. Here's a quote I found interesting. This is a quote from Trigg Steen, who's an environmental science professor, or he was, I'm not sure if he still is, at Portland State University. I took in the 1990s a class from him in forest ecology, and it was interesting and excellent. Now, he's an evolutionist. He's a really good observer of the forest and very knowledgeable, and he wrote this. I think it's got something to say. So he said, so this three-way team, that is the fungus, the algae, and the bacteria in the lichen, this collaboration is really fundamental to maintaining the flow of nitrogen through our forest ecosystems. And this collaboration raises to me a really, really fundamental point that people miss. And we will run into it again and again. And that is that people often think about Darwinian evolution as being survival of the fittest, tooth and claw, wipe out the other guy, win at all costs, but mainly get rid of everything else. In reality, survival of the fittest in a forest ecosystem very often means not killing off, but collaborating. Collaboration and teamwork end up trumping in a huge array of cases. And in fact, the whole forest is ultimately dependent on collaboration, not fundamentally competition. And this lichen, lungwort, is certainly a beautiful example of it. So remember that word, collaboration, that he used, because I do believe it accurately describes much of what happens in a forest ecosystem. And you can think about the implications of that. Listed here are the major processes that occur in a west side forest canopy. I won't dwell on them, but let me just mention them. There's a lot going on in the forest canopy. It's the major site of photosynthesis. The sun's energy is captured by the plants and stored as sugar. Carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere to make that sugar, and oxygen is released by photosynthesis to replenish what has been used up by animals. Transpiration occurs, and that is the water loss from the needles or leaves of plants. And so soil water, which usually comes from rain, goes into the soil, and the plant's roots take up the water, and then they lift that water 200 feet or so up into the sky by their vascular system, and then it gets released through little pores in the leaves or the needles, depending on what kind of tree it is, and it gets back into the atmosphere from whence it came. So this is a part of the water cycle or hydrologic cycle. The reproduction of trees, a lot of the processes occur in the canopy, or they're maximal in the canopy. The formation of cones and seeds of pollen, of the process of pollination, seed dispersal, are all in large measure conducted in the forest canopy. And then there's all kinds of interactions with sunlight. The canopy controls the light of the entire forest. Where there are gaps in the canopy, sunlight reaches the forest floor, at least during certain parts of the day. Where there are no gaps, it's pretty dark and shady. There's interactions with the atmosphere as well. The canopy captures fog and rain and snow and ice. For example, fog condenses on the needles of many conifers. And then those needle drops, those drops on the needle fall to the forest floor. And this needle drip has been calculated to be responsible for up to 50% of the precipitation in some forests, particularly coastal ones. In winter, snow and ice weigh down the trees, and so twigs and branches and entire trunks fall to the forest floor, and then they are entered into the decomposition processes that go on there. Canopy plants in the canopy will intercept airborne nutrients, like dust basically flying through the air. And it's said that the sandstorms that occur in the Sahara Desert feed the air plants, like the orchids, of Brazil, and that's true. There is food for plants that sails that distance. Lightning strikes canopy trees. It produces snags, which produces good wildlife habitats. By the way, lightning also fixes nitrogen. We keep coming back to nitrogen. It's terribly important. Nutrient cycling, I've mentioned nitrogen fixation, and we'll pass on that one. The canopy is home of the epiphytes. We've talked about that as well. But one thing interesting about epiphytes is when they cover branches and big parts of these trees in the canopy, they actually form soil. So it's actually soil that is formed in the canopy that exists there. And that brings us to the next topic there, number 8. And there was a young lady named Nalini Nadkarni who was a student at University of Washington. She was in forestry, and she liked to climb trees. I guess that's good if a forester does that. But she took on research in the big leaf maple trees on the Olympic Peninsula, which are just covered with all these, mosses and ferns and so forth, just huge numbers of epiphytes. So she started peeling back the masses of epiphytes on the branches of trees, and she found what looked like roots coming out of the branches, going into these masses of epiphytes and into the soil that was created by the epiphytes. And she took samples back to her professors, and they'd never seen anything like that. Well, the whole situation was studied, and it turned out she was the discoverer of what are now called canopy roots. There's a number of trees that will put roots out in their branches that go into the masses of plant material growing on the tree. Why do they do that? Well, they can extract water, and they can extract nitrogen and phosphorus and other nutrients, and so it's a wealth that's in the canopy of the tree, and the tree mines it, makes it beneficial to itself. Of course, the canopy is a source of forest floor litter. It produces structural complexity. Think about this. Excuse me. A plantation forest has simple structure. It is one tree species planted at the same time, so the height is about the same, and it's a very basic, simple structure. In old forest, the longer it lives, the more complex the plants become. There's old trees and young trees, there's different species of trees, they're all different sizes and shapes and so forth. There are all kinds of other plants. It's a complex structure. And so that complex structure then produces a lot of variety in homes or niches for creatures or other plants to grow in and other animals to inhabit. For example, invertebrates are common and numerous and many, many species in the forest canopy, and I mean like bugs. There are thousands of species up there. They're discovering new ones all the time, and for some they know what they do, but most of them they don't know what they're doing up there. But they're probably doing something, and it's very likely it's of some value. So it's a great place for research in that way. There also are vertebrate animals that you rarely see at ground level, like when you're hiking, but they live in the canopy of the forest. And here's an example. I was on the Salmon River Trail in an old forest, and I found this unfortunate bird, which is a hermit warbler, and it was very much dead. Normally this lives in the tropics, in Central America, particularly Mexico, and then it winters there, and it comes north, and it inhabits our forest canopies to reproduce. But you seldom see it at ground level, except in a situation like this. I'd never seen one before up there. So I thought this is a passage of Scripture that's appropriate. Psalm 50 says, "For every beast of the forest is mine," God speaking. "I know all the birds of the hills." And then in Matthew 10, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from the will of your Father." So sounds like the Creator knew this little warbler and was aware of its fall from the forest canopy. And I found this material in an old forest along the Clackamas River. It's not a feather, that's hair, and it's really flat. It's really flat, and it took me a little while to figure out what it is, but that's the end of a tail of a northern flying squirrel. They have flat tails, acts as a rudder as they glide from tree to tree, and they live up in the canopy. You never see them. Of course, they're nocturnal also, but just another evidence found on the ground of what goes on in the canopy. Well, now let's descend from the canopy to the forest floor and look at decomposition and nutrient recycling. And no, Waste Management Company did not invent recycling, God did. So consider this. Day and night, organic debris falls from the canopy to the forest floor. It includes needles, broadleaves, cones, seeds, pieces of moss and lichen, dead bugs, feathers, droppings from birds and arboreal mammals, twigs, pieces of bark and wood, and on occasion, centuries-old mammoth trees, both living and dead. And then all of this accumulated debris forms this litter layer on the forest floor, and then some remarkable things happen over days, months, years, even centuries. This material is broken down to its basic elements, incorporated into the soil, and again becomes available for growing plants to use. How does all this happen? Here's a very important organism in the decomposition process. It's a yellow-spotted millipede. Now, you might have seen these if you hike on our forest trails. They're commonly walking multi-leggedly across the trail. And if you picked one up and sniffed it, it would smell like almonds. And I'm sure you would have been inclined to sniff these if you saw one, wouldn't you? And that's because they release cyanide gas, which smells like almonds. And it's not enough to hurt a human, so it wouldn't bother you, but it's enough to deter or to defend them from some small would-be predators like maybe shrews and things of that sort. The coloration of those yellow spots is also a warning that this bug is not to be messed with. Well, so why is the millipede important? It provides entry into the decomposition process for up to half of all dead conifer needles and broadleaves, like maple, that land on the forest floor. This accounts for the entry of those materials into the decomposition process. These millipedes are called shredders. And what they do is they crush plant cells, plant tissue, and they expose the cell contents. And then after absorbing nutrients for themselves, the millipedes excrete the mashed plant material as fecal pellets, which are then digested by a series of bacterial and fungal species. And the end result is that all the nutrients in the leaves are returned to the soil to be again taken up by plants. Here's quotes from Andrew Moldenke, an entomologist at Oregon State University. And he says, throughout the northwest forest, the principal shredder is the cyanide-producing millipede. It gives the scientific name of Harpaphe haydeniana. It is the shredder that is key to the process. The cyanide-producing millipede alone eats 33 to 50% of all dead conifer and deciduous leaves that come to rest on the forest floor. It is one of the most critical links in the entire soil food web. He concludes with being tiny is not the same as being unimportant. Well, here's another member of the forest floor cleanup crew, a banana slug. Now, this is a different species than the bright yellow one I showed you in the redwoods. We might call this dark olive-colored specimen an overripe banana slug. Let's look at some features of this critter. Up front are 4 retractable tentacles. The top 2 detect light, so eyes of a sort, and the bottom 2 are for smell and touch. The head is covered with a mantle, and there's a breathing pore, which you can see there, and the breathing pore is always on the right side. There's none on the left side. The undersurface is its foot on which it glides. Now notice that on the back of the animal are some conifer needles that have landed. These critters are kind of sticky, so things stick to them like the needles. And so you might wonder, with forest debris landing on this, why isn't it just covered with forest debris? How does it keep clean? And the answer is that it has these skin glands that produce a layer of slime. And that slime moves like a conveyor belt towards the rear end of the slug. And it carries with it the debris that has landed, and it forms a mucus plug you can see on the end of this one, and there's some needles there. And then periodically the slug turns around and eats the mucus plug. So this is pretty amazing. It's a self-cleaning system, and then the slug recycles slime as well. So pretty cool, huh? I think. You laugh, but our respiratory system has a mucociliary escalator, mucus that ascends our airways and carries little particles and debris up to our throat where we swallow it. So we're doing the same thing. Either we're related to the slug or we have the same creator. Think about that. Here are some things that slugs eat, thus, again, providing entry for these materials into decomposition. live and decaying vegetation of all sorts. Interestingly, they like poison oak. And I've never seen one scratch, so I don't think they itch. The roots, fruit, seeds, bulbs, mushrooms, lichens, algae, animal droppings and carcasses, and much more. And so I think you can see that the banana slug is a beautiful, useful, and interesting animal. And that is why it was chosen by students as the official mascot for the University of California at Santa Cruz. They are the banana slugs. And you can see this slug there is reading a book. And if you look closely, the book is entitled Plato. Well, we've just seen that small forest floor debris can enter decomposition processes by means of millipedes and slugs and some other organisms. But what about a huge standing tree bole or a tree trunk like this? When they're dead, you'd call it a snag. How is it decomposed? And what about large logs on the forest floor? And such materials are fallen branches and logs and so forth are termed coarse woody debris in ecological jargon, and it's abundant in old forests. And such debris can be very large, as seen in this old decaying log in the Olympic National Forest in Washington. And here's a cross-section of a 650-year-old tree displayed in the Olympic National Park Visitor Center near Port Angeles. And we can see the markings on this exhibit show that the first arrow indicates the tree started growing in 1349. The second arrow points to 1492, when Columbus came to the New World, and the third to 1620, when the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock. So the question comes to mind is, how does a huge log like this decompose? What processes and organisms are involved, and how long might it take? So to find answers, we should look at a research project currently underway, imaginatively described as the Log Decomposition Study. And it's taking place at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest in the Willamette National Forest. That's about 40 miles east of Eugene. The principal investigator is Dr. Mark Harmon, and the goal is to learn how logs decay. The study consisted of taking 500 sections of log, not complete logs, but big sections, of 4 conifer species, and then arranging them in the forest according to a certain pattern. The study began in 1985, and its duration is slated to be 200 years. So Dr. Harmon is not planning on completing it himself. But it's an example of a long-term ecological study. And there's a number of these, and they're important because, well, think about it. Most studies that have been done over 2 or 3 years, because the person doing it is a graduate student who needs to get his master's or doctoral degree in 2 or 3 years. And so that's fine, and that's been very helpful, but a lot of ecological processes are not short-term, they're very, very long-term. So if you're going to try to get a handle on some of these things, like log decay, it has to be a much more extended study. Here, researchers are preparing a log section to be transported by a cable to a study site. And then at various time intervals, these logs that were put out in the forest are sampled. Sections are cut, and they call these sections cookies. And so I guess you could say this chainsaw that the fellow is using there is a cookie cutter. Here is a cookie displayed. The TSHE at the bottom means it's a western hemlock. It was cut September 24th, 1992, which is 7 years after being placed in the study site. Its diameter is 55 centimeters. The undecayed wood has been outlined, and the rotting areas are labeled. You can see excavations from certain types of burrowing insects if you look closely, and there's discoloration from various types of fungi. And so these and many other observations on these logs are beginning to give a more comprehensive view of what happens in the decay process. Here's a recently cut trunk, and just to show you the names that I'll use when I describe the decay process, we can see here the bark on the outside, which is obvious. There's an inner bark, and there's the cambium is layered. It's a layer that's labeled, and that would be a living layer. The rest of this is pretty much, or is dead wood, dead cell material, cell wall material. And then from the cambium, you have the sapwood, which is lighter colored, and this is what conducts water in the tree. And then further in is heartwood, which is darker colored because it has certain chemicals there, but this forms a strong, decay-resistant central core to the log, which adds strength. So those are some of the terms that are used to describe a cross-section of a log. Now, I want to go through just very briefly and very quickly and in a very limited way what happens in decomposition. Don't try to remember this all, but just get the idea that there's a lot going on. So, it starts out with a conifer tree falls on the forest floor in a winter storm. In the spring, the inner bark, which was live material, ferments, producing an alcohol odor, which attracts a large number of ambrosia beetles. The ambrosia beetles carry with them, the ambrosia beetles bore through the bark and they form a network of tunnels. The ambrosia beetles also carry with them a special fungus which decomposes wood and thrives in the wood tunnels. And the ambrosia beetles use that fungus also as food, and then they produce larvae and more beetles. Soon bark beetles, different species of beetles, also arrive, and they release a pheromone chemical into the air that attracts more bark beetles. The bark beetles then dig tunnels and galleries into the surface wood and reproduce, and then their offspring dig even deeper in. Water, fungi, bacteria, and other insects enter the bark beetle tunnel networks. After months, something called the ponderous borer beetles, big ones. They arrive, they lay eggs in the bark, and then their large larvae bore deeply into the decay-resistant heartwood of the tree. Carpenter ants come and they invade the log. They build galleries and reproduce. Other organisms, including numerous species of mites, huge number of species, and nematodes, which are roundworms, they enter the system and do their thing. Predators are attracted to feed on the log's many inhabitants. They include tiny wasps and centipedes and salamanders and pileated woodpeckers and black bears. And the latter two, the woodpeckers and bears, actually mechanically break down the wood as they search for their lunch. By 3 years or so, wind-borne fungal spores have entered the tunnels, which produce special fungi that can break down the decay-resistant, hard, lignin-impregnated heartwood. Most things would not digest that. In about 10 years, when the wood has become soft and moist, damp wood termites invade. And their guts contain anaerobic, that is non-oxygen requiring, protozoans, one-celled organisms that are able to break down cellulose in wood. And the termite guts also contain, guess what, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which add nitrogen to the log. This is only a small part, but you get the idea. It's a complex relay of species after species after species, each doing its thing. And again, very complex and very important. Mark Harmon made this interesting observation. He says a dead tree actually is, if you tally up the number of living organisms, is far more alive than a living tree. So, in a large decaying log, hundreds of species of organisms, maybe thousands, work in concert, collaboration again, often for hundreds of years, to slowly release nutrients and return the fallen tree to the soil. And throughout these centuries, the log provides a steady stream of nutrients which feed the plants and animals of the forest. So the logs are doing some good. Here's an old decomposing log, and growing on it are several young western hemlocks. You've probably seen this. This is common. Most hemlocks begin life on so-called nurse logs rather than on the forest floor. It appears that the surface of the decaying log is a better seed plot for them than the moss of the forest floor. Also, the decaying logs here provide water, even during our long summer droughts. They are moist inside. When pioneers came to the Northwest, some of them were puzzled because they found all these hemlocks growing in straight rows. And they wondered, did the native peoples plant them that way or what? No. These hemlocks all started on a log, and the log has since decayed, and only the hemlocks were left in a row. Logs are commonly found in streams. Prior to the 1980s, it was common practice to remove logs from streams to clean up the streams so that they would not impede fish movement like salmon. However, studies at the Andrews Forest and elsewhere have shown that salmon and trout do better if logs are left in streams because the logs provide cover, they form calm pools, slow the currents down, reduce bank erosion, so forth. As in the forest, the logs also decompose and they release nutrients which nourish the aquatic insects in the stream, which are oftentimes the food for the fish. And so after all of this has been learned, the logs have been systematically put back in streams in an effort to restore salmon habitat. Now, not only do forest logs benefit salmon, but salmon benefit the forest. After spawning, salmon die and their carcasses release nutrients into the streams, which is good. But in addition, scavengers, the ravens, the turkey vultures, the gulls, eagles, bears, weasels, and so forth, eat the dead and dying salmon, and then these animals subsequently spread the nutrients throughout the forest. I know the pioneers in the old days, in the 1800s, would say of our northwest streams that you could walk across the stream on the backs of salmon. They were that numerous. And so each year then, millions of pounds of marine nutrients would come in from the Pacific Ocean, swim up our rivers, and then decompose, nourishing the rivers and the forest as well. And there are studies trying to quantitate how much our somewhat lessened salmon runs, how much impact that might have on the forest, and I don't know exactly any answers there. And with that, I think we'll take a break. That's really a broken tree there. Just a couple things. Take a look at our display table where Steve will be and see some things that I've already shown you, but see if you can recognize them. Also, if anybody is interested in this subject and wants a book to look at or to read, there's one called The Hidden Forest, The Biography of an Ecosystem by John Luoma. And I have a copy in the back. You can look at it. It's totally secular, but it's well written. It gives information about these researchers and what they've done and what they've found. And so I'd say it's a good starting place if you want to look at this sort of subject. And with that, we'll take our break. Mark.
Yes, and during...
That photo up there was taken on one of our field trips led by Caitlin Labar to look at butterflies up in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. So I highly recommend that trip, especially kids. They really love it. And they can see that tree, what remains of it. Well, let's look at a couple of other forest floor processes more briefly. This is Pacific bleeding heart, which blooms in our west side forests in the spring, and its flowers are heart-shaped, hence the name. And it forms these long seed pods that you can see in that photo. And when it's ripe, the seed pods are filled with these sort of strange-looking seeds. And here is a photo I took of one through the microscope, and it shows a sort of typical seed, but it's that sort of light-colored glob attached to it. What is that? And as you can see from the label, that is an eleosome. What, you might ask, is an eleosome? Well, it's defined as a tasty, nutrient-rich appendage that's attached to to seeds of certain plants. In other words, it's ant food. And so remember those canopy trees we talked about. The forest canopy, they reproduce with their seeds at the tops of the trees, and the wind blows, and the seeds sail for great distances and so forth. But think about the forest floor plants where the wind doesn't blow much. How do they disperse their seeds? And oftentimes the thing that disperses them is ants. That's fairly common. Now, seed dispersal by ants has a name. It's called myrmecochory. And the way it works is that the ants are attracted to that eleosome, and they carry it along with the attached seed. They carry it into their underground tunnels, where it becomes food for the ant larvae, and then the seed is discarded. Hence, it is now planted in rich soil, so it germinates. Again, collaboration of different species here, which is well illustrated by seed dispersal sometimes. Ants have many functions in forests. Here's a mound made by thatch ants that we saw on last summer's trip into the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, and that was taken close to that broken tree that I showed you. And the whole mound there was a bustle of activity. Thousands of ants were scurrying about, making improvements on their stick and needle and grass home. And or rather Jim McWhinney was with us, and he tracked the ants down an ant trail about 80 feet to a pine tree, and they were going up and down the pine tree, probably gathering food. So thatch ants are easily recognized. They have these reddish-brown heads and black bodies, black eyes, and they have a very complex social structure, and they interact with the forest in many ways which are positive. For example, thatch ants help control defoliating insects like the spruce budworm, which attacks several northwest conifer trees. So they are actually good citizens of the forest. A scripture here I felt was appropriate. Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest. Proverbs 6. I would be amiss, I think, if I didn't mention mycorrhizal fungi. I think I've talked about it previously in another talk, but let me just mention this. It's important. The term mycorrhizal comes from myco, which is fungus, and rhiza, which is root. So it really means fungus root. And here's a scanning electron micrograph showing root tips, which are the big structures, and then attached to those root tips are all the fungal filaments called hyphae that extend away from the root tips. Many of the mushrooms that you see in the forest are the fruiting bodies of these mycorrhizal fungi. How does this plant-fungus relationship work? Well, first of all, the fungus penetrates and explores the soil for tens of meters from the host plant. In fact, the fungus probably connects to several plants, maybe several trees. And then what it does is it collects and transports back to its host trees water and nutrients, like nitrogen and phosphorus and all kinds of soil nutrients. And such a relationship is, again, a symbiosis that we've talked about. And since the fungus benefits because the tree feeds it sugar solutions, and since the fungus provides nutrients for the tree, it's a mutualism, it's a win-win where both species benefit by this, again, collaboration. How common are mycorrhizal fungi? Well, extremely common. They find that most plants probably use fungi to attach to their roots and bring in nutrients. It's a very common thing. In fact, as far as I know, all trees in the Northwest utilize mycorrhizal fungi. So if we didn't have them, it would pose some big problems. Well, there's one other thing that I'd like to cover and that we haven't touched on and is important, which is this, it's fire. So forest fire is very obviously destructive, but it's also necessary for the health of many forests. I'm sure we've all heard that. It's been a common theme we hear about of late. For example, an old forest dominated by large Douglas fir trees, as we're seeing here. If you look around the forest floor, you'll find the Douglas fir cones, which have the three little mice tails protruding. But you can try and try and try, and you find no Douglas fir seedlings growing there. Douglas fir is not reproducing there, even though it produces seeds. Why isn't it reproducing? And the reason is, in order to germinate and produce a seedling, Douglas fir requires mineral soil. The seeds don't produce young trees on the mosses and all the organic debris. It requires mineral soil, and it requires a lot of sunlight, not shade. So when an old Douglas fir comes crashing down in such a forest, what is it replaced by? A Douglas fir? No, they're not there to replace it. It's replaced by hemlock, which are growing all over the place probably. So in that way, a Douglas fir forest over time will become a hemlock forest, and that's called succession, that type of process. So again, then how does Douglas fir ever regenerate? And as you might guess, the answer is fire. Because fire provides conditions needed for Douglas fir to reproduce. The Douglas fir itself, the big ones, often survive fire. They have that thick bark we talked about. They can store hundreds of gallons of water in their large trunks. And oftentimes the big Douglas firs will have no branches near the ground so that the canopy is protected from fire, and the tree survives. And then after a fire, a surviving Douglas fir will shower the area with seeds. And now they produce young trees because the fire has burned away the organic material on the forest floor, and the hemlock and the cedars with thin bark have probably been killed, and anyways, that has opened up the canopy, so a lot of sunlight comes in. And so fire regenerates Douglas fir forests. You can see something like that in the lodgepole pine. This is Yellowstone National Park, where Creation Encounter has brought tours. And lodgepole pine are also regenerated by fire, but in a different way. And the lodgepole pines, of course, are slender, non-tapering trunks of trees which were used by the Native Americans to build their teepees and lodges, hence the name of the tree. Young lodgepole pine forests are mostly composed of lodgepole pine, but over time, other trees come in, like the spruces and larches and true firs and so forth. And the lodgepoles are fairly short-lived, so gradually the lodgepole pine turns into a forest of different species. So how does the lodgepole pine regenerate? And again, it's by fire. Here's the thin bark, gray bark of a lodgepole. And so the fire comes through and it kills the lodgepole. Well, that doesn't sound good. But the lodgepole, then, they reproduce because they have large numbers of cones. And the tree gets killed, and many of the cones have already opened up and released their seeds, but the lodgepoles have certain cones that don't open up. They can stay for decades on the tree, and they only open with the heat of a forest fire. So the lodgepole fire, or the forest gets burned, and the heat opens up the cones, and they shower the mineral soil with seed, and the trees grow really well. These cones are called serotinous cones. They're conifer seed cones which are sealed shut by a wax-like material and do not open at maturity. They remain closed for up to 20 years, storing seeds, viable seeds, and they only open with the heat of a forest fire. And that's lodgepole pine, and another one in southwest Oregon called knobcone pine. So after the lodgepole, here's a burn, recent, not too old, a burn in Yellowstone Forest. And there you can see the lodgepole starting to be visible. And here they come along a lot further. And here wildlife is back. There's an elk feeding among the burnt trees. This is a beautiful open park-like ponderosa pine forest, which at least once was very common in the east slopes, the Cascades, and into eastern Oregon a bit. And it is maintained by fire as well. Because in these forests, the lodgepole or the ponderosa pines have fairly thick bark, and ground fires would come through here, and they burn away all the ground vegetation. They may char the trunk a bit, but they don't kill the trees, and so we end up with this open park-like forest of ponderosa pines. It's a real beautiful type of forest, I think, but it's maintained by periodic fires. If there is no fire, then the other trees will come in, and gradually it will change to some other type of forest other than the ponderosa pine. Well, as you drive past plantation forests, and recently as you look at TriMet buses in Portland, you will see some signs that say working forest, indicating a forest at work producing wood products. And I would suggest, however, that all forests, including unmanaged ones, are working forests, because they are producing products that we call ecosystem services. And listed here are the services provided by healthy Northwest forests. I'll just read through this quickly. They conduct photosynthesis. They help control the heat balance of the earth. They play important roles in the water cycle. They reduce erosion, floods, and debris flows. They maintain healthy streams. They provide good salmon and trout habitat. They moderate weather and climate. They create and preserve soils. They store carbon biomass. They conserve and cycle nutrients, as we've seen with nitrogen. They maintain biodiversity of plants and animals. They help control forest disease outbreaks, like we saw with the ants. There's aesthetic value, by which I mean beauty and scenery. There's spiritual values, not that we worship trees, but they do reflect the glory of their creator, certainly. And it supports scientific and educational activities. It provides recreational activities, hiking, camping, hunting, fishing, tourism, photography. And of course, they produce forest products, wood and paper and mushrooms and medicines, decorative plants, and so forth. So those are all ecosystem services, so-called. I'm going to conclude then with 5 statements, 5 conclusions. You may agree, you may disagree. We're going to have a little question and answer afterwards, and we can discuss some of these. But the first would be this. Forest ecosystems consist of thousands of biotic and abiotic components, which interact in complex and collaborative ways to produce an entity we call a forest. And this entity works well only if all the major parts are present and functioning. In other words, nothing works until everything works. And so just like we speak about cells and organisms being irreducibly complex as an evidence of creation, ecosystems are also irreducibly complex and therefore must, it seems, have been created whole, not cobbled together over millions of years, piece by piece. And you can maybe remember Michael Behe in his book, Darwin's Black Box, gives the example of the mousetrap as something illustrating irreducible complexity. A quote from Jack Ward Thomas, chief of the Forest Service in the 90s. Ecosystems are not only more complex than we think, they are more complex than we can think, and I think that's true. To illustrate a little bit, from the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest, they keep a list of all the organisms that live there. And I have their lists, and the list for arthropods, that is bugs and spiders and so forth, has 3,400 scientific names listed, a whole lot of them. There's 500 vascular plants, 174 bird species, 105 epiphytic macrolichens, that is the lichens that hang in the tops of the trees, 53 mammals, 40 mycorrhizal fungal species, 20 amphibians and reptiles, and 9 fishes. Well over, and those are minimal. Those are not complete lists, and so there's thousands and thousands of species of creatures out there, all of which have certain adaptations, all of which have certain niches, all of which have certain things they do And I think most of them, we would say, have a role to play in the forest. So when you have that many moving parts, the system is very complicated. Number two point I put down was that implicit in the Dominion mandate, it would seem, is a requirement for knowledge about forest ecosystems, which must be acquired through careful and good scientific study. Here's a quote from forest ecologist Jerry Franklin. He says, "Stewardship of our forest resources is one of the great challenges of the 21st century and is a first principle in responsible management. And a first principle in responsible management is knowledge." Third point, good biblical stewardship should take into consideration the full array of forest ecosystem services provided by the Creator. In addition to timber harvest, attention should be given to fish and wildlife management, recreation, scientific and educational pursuits, as well as simply the preservation of the beauty and majesty of our great forests. I like a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. He said, "There is nothing more practical in the end than the preservation of beauty. I feel most emphatically that we should not turn into shingles a tree which was old when the first Egyptian conquerors penetrated to the valley of the Euphrates." He had a way of putting things. Fourth point, to learn how to manage forests for multiple ecosystem services, not just wood production, but for multiple services, we should study the natural or unmanaged forests. I recall my diagram. And we should mimic them. Why is that? Well, simply because those forests do successfully provide multiple ecosystem services simultaneously. They know how to do it. And in reality, unmanaged forests are not unmanaged, but are controlled by their Creator, who is God. And here at DSA, we've had programs in which we have seen the fruitfulness of mimicking God's handiwork in human endeavors. And that strategy appears to apply to forest management as well. Here's a major book on this subject. This is called Ecological Forest Management by Jerry Franklin and others. It doesn't mention creation or God or anything. It's a totally secular book. But it's taking the idea that we should manage forests for harvest, yes, but also for other benefits that we get from forests. And it gives a lot of information about how that can be successfully done, and a lot of forest managers are paying attention to this sort of idea. One quote from the book, it just says, "The entire spectrum of disturbance types and scales, from the small and frequent to the large and infrequent, provide models for creation and manipulation of forests in ecological forest management. Study how the forest works and learn how to manage it." Last point is that Christians should provide quality outdoor education based on a biblical worldview for children and adults in order to promote an appreciation for and understanding of ecosystems and their stewarding, as we attempt to do through Creation Encounter. And perhaps Christians should even become leaders, promoting sound and balanced forest management practices. After all, we worship the God who created and sustains forests. And with this view of vine maple leaves in autumn, I will end, and thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Keith. Very interesting.